Hi, everybody. This is Buzz with a quick note before this podcast begins. When I did the first edit on it, this thing came in at just under 1 hour and 50 minutes. Now, that's way too long to ask any of you guys to sit in one place. So I've cut it into two pieces, and this is part one of the years 2010 to 2014. You're going to get years 2010 and 2011. I hope you enjoy it. The second part will be next week. On with the podcast. Hello, FC Dallas Curious fans, and welcome to another edition of Third Degree, the podcast. This is episode 61. I am Buzz Carrick, your host for today, the founder of Third Degree. Not here today, as they have not been for the length of our historic Look Back podcast. Our usual partners, Peter Welton and Dan Crook. But this is indeed episode 4 of our FC Dallas History Look Back. Today, we're going to be talking about 2010 to 2014. Just a quick reminder before we get into the show, this podcast is patron supported. There are no advertisements on the podcast. We'd like to keep it that way. If you like the podcast, or if you like anything we do on the blog or the Instagrams or the Twitters or whatever else we do in terms of reporting for FC Dallas, you can support us at patreon.com/third degree. And I hope you will choose to do so in whatever capacity you feel appropriate. All right, last episode, we had Tobias Lopez again come in. Special thanks to him. That was the last episode of the history. We took a short break from the history to talk to Damon Gochner, the owner of Denton Diablos, who gave us a good in-depth look into minor league soccer in the United States in the pandemic time and the impact it's having, which is, I think, a really in-depth good listen if you're interested in that. And then we did a podcast on MLS, because that's the only thing that FC Dallas is doing on a competitive level right now. And while that's not my bag per se, I think if you're into the e-gaming, it was a terrific podcast with Dan and the young man whose name I cannot pronounce in gamer speak. That's the FC Dallas. I think it's Ibis9 or something like that is the gamer tag for the guy who plays for FC Dallas. But if that's your bag, check it out, because I think it was a terrific podcast. All right, we had planned today to have on Wayne McMullen, who is a former Beer Guardians leadership person. He's been involved in FC Dallas supporter culture for a long time. He's also the current play-by-play guy for the Denton Diablos. He's recently gotten into broadcast, and he's the host of the West Ham Is Why We Drink podcast. So if you're into West Ham or supporters culture and for English football, you should give that a try. But Wayne has had some what I would call catastrophic technical issues with his computer, and which involves, as I understand it, buying an entire new computer. So who knows when he'll be back, and someday we'll have him back on. So we've gone to the bench and brought in another player that could be a starter in anybody's book. And that is a friend of the podcast, a friend of Third Degree, who's been writing for us on and off for almost 20 years, probably. He's been involved in supporters culture as well in terms of leadership, and he's one of the founding members of the Brimstone Cup Committee, and that is Kevin Lindstrom. Kevin, welcome to the podcast, my friend.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited. This should be fun.
All right, let's get into the history, Kevin. Now, if you listened out there, fans, listen to our last podcast, and I know Kevin did because we talked about it.
Absolutely.
From in 2009, that was not a good season for FC Dallas. They finished 7th out of 8 teams under Schell's Hyman. Mm-hmm. But at this point in 2010, he's not going into a complete rebuild. Coming out of 2009, they have David Ferreira is already on the roster. Jeff Cunningham had won the Golden Boot. Heath Pierce is on the team. Ugo Iamalu is in town. George John's a full-time starter. Daniel Hernandez is in place. Atiba Harris is in place. Dax McCarty has become a starter. Marvin Chavez is in. Dyer Benitez is in. So basically the rebuild has happened already, and Schellas is just looking to tweak the team for 2010 and make some strides forward. But bizarrely, over the winter, Kevin, and I'm sure you remember this, Dave Vandenberg is let go after he has one of the great assist seasons in club history, feeding Jeff Cunningham. Bizarrely, they just let him go for allegedly complaining about Schellas' coaching of all things. And then FC Dallas doesn't trade him or his rights. They just sit on his rights, and basically the guy never plays again.
Yeah, it was a shocking moment. Frankly, I was disappointed in the league as a whole at that time, because it's an example of what was wrong with the structure. you can't just sit on someone's right. I think that happened to a couple of players. Ronnie O'Brien, if I remember correctly, got into that a little bit. And Vandenberg was such a phenomenal player that, if they traded him, whatever, figured something out, that'd be fine. But they didn't. They just kind of let him rot. And it was the only thing I looked at it, just trying to take a step back and look at it objectively, is it was moving money from him to other players so that they could have a more balanced team. And I think there's probably some value to that. It was an awful situation for Vandenberg, and it certainly hurt the team in terms of service from the left side.
Now, Schellas is upfront and open. If he thinks you suck, he will say you suck to your face. He will cut bait on guys that get in battles with him. He will get rid of them fast. This will come up again as we go through this next season. And it came up even before this, when basically he'd run into troubles with Ricchetti, who in the middle of 2009 basically quit on the team after they brought in Danny Hernandez. But anyway, let's move on to 2010, because that's what we're here to talk about. Aside from getting rid of Dave Vandenberg over the winter, they also draft Zach Lloyd. He's an impact player fairly quickly. And there's not a lot else that gets picked that year that's any good, other than Eric Alexander, who is a steal pretty much in the third round. Again, that'll come up big here in a second. And there are some other good additions. Kevin, I'm sure you remember Jackson comes in, mostly originally thought to be a defender, but he does play a lot in the midfield. But the biggest addition coming into 2010, and this is without question in my mind, is Kevin Hartman. Because Kansas City, as I stumble over why this deal happened, I'm now remembering Kansas City had him and they failed to re-sign him to a deal, and Dallas trades for his rights basically, and then signs Hartman. And let's talk about Hartman in 2010 and why this is such a huge addition. He had a 0.62 GAA that season, which is the lowest in FC Dallas history by a long shot, Kevin. It's the only one ever below 1 in their history. And Hartman won Player of the Month in that season, and he only gave up 1 goal in 4 games in that month, and he's just one of 6 players to ever win Player of the Month. And I don't think you can undersell when you go from 9th place to essentially high up. I don't remember what place it is. We'll get back to it in a minute. High up in the Western Conference standings. Basically, it's all on this one huge, massive addition of Kevin Hartman in goal.
He was a huge part of it. My thought was the transition started, as you said, in 2009.
Right.
You're bringing in Ugo, you're bringing in Danielle, giving them a chance to kind of settle in. You already have all the other pieces in place. And then when you add Hartman, it's literally the last key foundational point. I wouldn't say he was the only reason, but he was definitely a keystone part of what took them to another level. I think they ended up 3rd in the West, but they were clearly one of the best teams in the league.
Yeah, and all those other players we had talked about were already in place. This is the one addition as we jump into 2010. But 2010, if really, in addition to the great play of Kevin Hartman, which we're going to come back to again more in a minute.
It was phenomenal. Phenomenal.
2010 really, and I think you'll agree with this, is the season of David Ferreira. MLS MVP,
Absolutely.
MLS Best 11, MLS All-Star. He did it all that year. Now, Cunningham is scoring the goals, but David is the offensive creator. And to be fair, offensively, he pretty much, because remember, Vandenberg's gone. He's pretty much carrying that team on his back in a lot of ways, isn't he, David?
Well, so what I loved about this season as a whole, just to talk about the arc of it, is FC Dallas was very good at working you over 80 minutes and then making the play to win the game or tie the game or get whatever result they needed out of it in the last 10. And David's intelligence, his physical ability to take punishment, and his skill all played into that. And I mean, me personally, I'd love to have a discussion between whether that was a better season or Jason Kreis's 99 season. And I think those are the top 2 in Dallas history, hands down, in terms of the importance to the team and how they shaped how the team played.
Yeah, I think that's a fair shake. I might give that Cunningham's Golden Boot season where he had like 8 assists as well. That's a pretty strong season too. But I certainly agree that David and Kreis and I'd throw in that third guy. This is one of the great seasons if it's not the greatest, it's still one of the greatest in FC Dallas history by an individual player. If you want to throw in 2016, that's more of a team for me. That's not going to be in this podcast, but Mauro Diaz in that group, that's more of a balanced team than this team. This team is a little lopsided because other than David, there's only 2 other players that have even more than 3 assists. Think about that. And that's Breck Shea, who's just now coming into his own, and Heath Pierce, who has 6, and he's an all-star this season too. So, so other than David, Breck and Heath Pierce are doing quality work. But you see what I mean when we say, and those are the only 2 guys that were over 3 in terms of David carrying the team, and then those 2 guys offering some contribution.
Right. Yeah, no. I mean, this was definitely David's team, and he basically owned Major League Soccer through this team. He let everybody do their part, and he picked his spots and made it count when the time was right.
Now we're going to talk about Heath Pierce some more in a minute, but this was as we started to see the emergence of Breck Shea, and I think we all were beginning to see the potential in him, mostly as a wide left midfielder or as a left wing. Shellis used both a 4 or a 3, depending on the season or the situation. So, I think we were beginning to see some of the hallmarks of what would make Breck great over the next couple of seasons in this year.
Oh, absolutely. I tried to peg kind of what was an explosive season for a player, emerging season. This was definitely an emerging season for Breck, and it was when people started really getting excited that, hey, that tall, lanky kid really had some skill and could do some damage.
Yeah, I think Breck's emergence is what contributes to some moves that happen after this year's over. But again, like I said, that'll come up as we go on.
Absolutely.
In 2010, I think it's pretty fair, and this is probably true of most of Shellis's career. He didn't give a toss about the Open Cup. He pretty much played some reserves against DC United in the first round, and they got stomped 3-1. Yeah. I honestly feel like at the time I felt like this, and I feel like this going back. I was pretty sure that Shellis was just happy not to have to play those games anymore.
Yeah, I don't know. As someone who's always loved the nature of the Open Cup, that frustrated me a little bit. This season, if I remember correctly, it was so early and it was so random. I want to say it was like a Wednesday in the first couple of months of the season. And it was a play-in game, which Dallas wasn't.
MLS qualification, right. They went straight into the tournament.
Yeah, so for a variety of reasons, of all the ones, this is one that I kind of didn't have too much of a problem with.
Yeah, I think I might agree with that too in hindsight. That MLS qualification was weird. Shellis had a lot of other things going on at that point in the season anyway. All right.
And especially as bad as 2009 was, he had to get things right in 2010.
Absolutely. And to be fair, as good as David Ferreira was, we mentioned that he was carrying the offense for the most part. To be honest, 2010 is actually the season of defense because they only allowed 28 goals, which is the best in FC Dallas history by 6-goal margin. Yeah. The normal back four at the time was normal, being the standard most often choice was Jair Benitez, Ugo Iamolu, George John, and Zach Lloyd with Daniel Hernandez in front of them, Kevin Hartman behind. And obviously Heath Pierce and Jackson both also figured in the back line at various times. So knowing what we know about the careers of those individuals as a collective, you can see why, even just on paper, that is a remarkably good defense. And at that time, really young too, as John and Lloyd are both pretty young, and Jackson is too, for that matter.
I think you could make a pretty good argument. You have 6 legitimate MLS starters on defense in that rotation. Obviously, Zach was a rookie, so maybe a little bit of a hesitation there, just from a perception standpoint. But clearly, the quality was there. So yeah, I mean that when you put that back 6 is what I would call it. So your defensive midfield, 4 defenders, and your goalkeeper. One of the best in league history, I think.
Yeah, I think all of those names ended up in our top 5 rankings lists in pretty much every one of those positions. So it's not surprising that defense is as quality as it was. And not surprisingly, Kevin, if you'll remember this, I'm sure that as good as that defense was, there were a lot of ties in 2010. They were 12-4 and 14 ties. They took a lot of losses and turned them into ties with that defense.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was saying earlier in terms of they're going to make you work throughout the game, both physically, mentally, tactically, all that stuff. And then wherever they are in that last 10 minutes, if they're behind a goal, they're going to find a way to tie it. If they're tied, they're going to find a way to win it. And I wish I had been able to look it up, but I want to say there was a number of times that season where they scored in the last 10, 15 minutes, and it really became a trend.
Yeah, it's definitely a trend. I remember feeling like this team was never out of it,
No.
when they would play.
Yep.
Now, bizarrely, Kev, 2010 is the summer of perhaps the best offensive, or maybe even just best summer signing period. And when I say the name, you're going to be like, really? And the name is Milton Rodriguez. And you're like, I don't remember him being a great signing, but he had 5 goals in 13 games. That's a remarkable track record for this club from a summer signing. That's remarkable.
No, I was again, at this point in time, I was working for the team, and I remember when he was signed going, okay, is this going to be kind of a king of goals guy? I don't know if you remember that from the Metro Stars signing. What was it, 97 or something like that?
I don't, but I'll take your word for it.
They brought some guy up from South America, and they called him the king of goals because he'd scored a ton of goals, but his game just didn't translate to Major League Soccer. And
the Coleman of New York Red Bulls.
Yes. Well, the Metro Stars at the time, but yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, where's this guy going to fall on that? Because he didn't strike me as, a Carlos Ruiz type player, but, where is he in that universe? And early on, I remember thinking, this guy's doing the work. This guy's doing the things that usually make for success in Major League Soccer. I remember him. And as a matter of fact, I remember I've got a poster of his that I remember I still have. It's up in my son's room, and I like looking at it from time to time, both because of the year and because of his place in it. Although obviously that created some tension with Jeff, which that's a separate story.
Yeah, one of the things about Cunningham, and this will come up when we get to the playoff section, is that over the course of the season, he began to start less and less and less, and began to be an off the bench player, and yet he still led FC Dallas in scoring, despite the fact that he was not a starter. Which again, this team was about defense, and that inability of Cunningham to play 90, and the inability for anybody else but Cunningham to score, even though it wasn't starting. I mean, Atiba Harris was the other option, and eventually they go to Milton Rodriguez, who was a solid signing, but. Regardless, there was definitely a disconnect-ish in the offensive end of the field compared to the defensive end of the field, certainly.
Absolutely. And, in some ways you love being able to bring off someone like Cunningham off the bench and go, yeah, we've been running you ragged for 60 minutes and now he's going to come at you.
Yeah. Good luck. Good luck.
But they never really got into a flow with that as much as I think they could have.
They could have. Yeah, that's true. Now I went through over the season, and that didn't come up with any really significant signature wins, but FC Dallas does crank it up over the back half of the season after Rodriguez comes in, and there's a point at which they win 6 straight home games with a win, which was a record at the time, and they went 15 games unbeaten, which is at the time was an MLS and club record. And really, the back half of the season, Kevin, it really just all came together, didn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely, and for me, this was one of the most magical seasons. It's one of my favorite teams, mostly because of some of the things I've already said, but because they were peaking at the right time. And how many times have we seen in MLS from the beginning? I mean, from 96 on, that it's the teams that get hot in the second half. I mean, now it's the Seattle move, basically, or maneuver, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
Where they pick up some signing in the middle of the season, they're mid-table, and next thing you know, they're challenging for the MLS Cup by the time it's all over. And Dallas was finally doing that. They had a couple of hiccups there at the end, but I didn't worry about that too much because there's so much good soccer that we were seeing for such a long stretch. And yeah, it was phenomenal. I loved seeing the consistency, the ability to be better than the other team 9 times out of 10 in some facet. And you really had to work to beat them. It was pretty cool.
Now, you mentioned a couple stumbles at the end of the season, and one reason that happened was because of the most bizarre moment of the season for me, and it wouldn't
hands down.
It wouldn't be the FC Dallas team, the Dallas Burn, the whole franchise, without some bizarro injury to derail things, right? So the crazy moment, and I know you know what I'm talking about, is
absolutely
the dead ball incident when
September 16.
Yeah,
yep, absolutely.
When
Thierry
Kevin
Henry.
Hartman's trying to get a ball ready for a goal kick, and Thierry Henry comes running through and tries to volley it into the stands or something, and Hartman's leg is in the way, and Hartman drops with a strained knee and misses a little bit of action, and that causes some stumble, and it just is one of the most crazy moments right at the end of a season, and again with this franchise and its ability to stumble right at the wrong moment.
Yep, absolutely. And I mean, as someone who's been here from the beginning, I think that's definitely a top 5 craziest moments in team history.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned stumbling. The last 2 games, they lost on the road to RSL and they lost on the road to LA Galaxy. And they do finish 3rd in the West, which means, of course, that they get the number 2 seed, Real Salt Lake in round 1. FC Dallas goes down early in game 1, but Cunningham ties it. And then Javier Morales gets a red card in the 49th minute. And then Atiba Harris gets a red card in the 88th minute. And one of our favorite bench players and hot late game off the bench attackers, Erick Avila, steals the game in the final minutes to win game 1.
Yeah, I think if I were to put a list of my favorite moments in team history, that may be the one. And that includes winning the Open Cup.
Wow.
That includes 2016. Because here was the thing. Remember the buildup we've been talking about throughout this season. Especially giving up a goal, right, to go down. Yeah. On the road. Have to go to Salt at home. The first game was at home. Remember?
Was it?
Yeah, the first game was at home. The second game was going to be at Salt Lake. So if you win at home, you've got a problem, right?
Yeah.
And so we give up the first goal. And it's like, okay, are we going to be the Dallas Burn again?
Of course they are.
Way to give this away. And then obviously Cunningham tied it. And then you got the bizarre red card. It's like, okay. And then, I didn't worry too much about Atiba's red card because we had started to impose ourselves. And this is going to come back in the final. But we had gotten back to what we did, which was imposing ourselves. And then the thing that just really gets me excited is to watch David Ferreira's involvement in the play with Erick so early on near midfield. And then just the way that he bursts into it. And it's just like, you know what? I don't care what fate says. I don't care what the team is. Screw it. I'm going to have a moment. And it was a moment that, it was just awesome. It really, and frankly, it set up the win against LA, which obviously we'll get to, here in a minute. But that to me was just kind of the crystallizing moment of this is not the average team. This isn't what we've seen, the team that's found a way, whether it's Calamari or a Paul Broom handball in Los Angeles in 99 or whatever crazy thing is going to keep us from being successusul. It was
Suter shrimp.
Yeah, calamari. That was the calamari.
Calamari.
Right.
Yeah.
Just some crazy, bizarre thing that's going to impact things.
Yeah.
It was, we're not going to let our history define us, and it was a pretty cool moment. So yeah,
it was a good moment. All right. In game 2, Dax McCarty scores early, and then FC Dallas holds on for the road win. You were correct. And they eliminate the defending champs. They are the defending champs, coached by our old friend, Jason Kreis, of course, at the time. So in round 2,
and he was not happy.
No, I will admit,
not happy.
I think he would admit that there was a little bit of bad blood between Jason and the Hunts with the way his time in Dallas ended. I'm glad to see, this is a side note to the history, I'm glad to see that them reach out to him recently with a little bit of the throwback games they've been airing and getting him involved. That's a real positive, I think.
Absolutely. And that was one of the tough moments as a fan, is to see that conflict because, on one hand, there's part of it where I didn't take it too seriously because, my God, Jason was one of the most competitive people I've ever met. I got a chance to, I got to know him. I don't know if you knew this. I was actually involved with a minor league team, the Texas Toros, and his wife was working for the team administration. So I kind of got to know him a little bit there. Just you see different sides of people. And, I was not surprised at all when he and Garth went to Salt Lake and had success. Not surprised at all. I've been a little surprised he didn't have success after that.
Well, he got the short end of the stick in New York City, and he didn't get any support in Orlando. And and not to diverge our history pod, but when Orlando, he was basically 500 when they let him go, and then they didn't win. Yeah. They won no games the rest of that year, which I think is indicative of how good a coach he is. So, but that's a different podcast. Let's keep going with this one. So in round 2, the format goes to a knockout style, and FC Dallas has the tough task of going to LA to face the Supporter Shield winning Galaxy. And Dallas proceeds to just stomped the tar out of the Galaxy.
Yeah.
3-0 on the road.
It was embarrassing.
Yeah, with goals by Ferreira, George John, and Marvin Chavez. This is one of the most comprehensive and dominant road wins in franchise history, and it comes against one of the best teams in the history of MLS, the LA Galaxy.
And I would add unexpected, because everybody was because I mean, LA was on a tear that year.
That's Beckham's LA, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they were supposedly destined to be, they were going to win it all. It was very much the David versus Goliath. And
that's funny.
Right. I remember the joke being made at the time, and it's still true.
Yeah.
There have been 2 games in my life where I went in, huge moment, expecting the worst, and got the exact opposite. And the other was beating Portugal in Korea. Because we had heard, luckily being in Korea at the game, we had heard through the grapevine that Mathis was injured, that a couple other players weren't going to start, Claudio wasn't going to start, and they were going to have to start Beasley and Donovan. We're like, we're going to get destroyed. And then obviously it turned into like one of the most amazing moments in U.S. history. And this was kind of the corollary for FC Dallas, because I can't remember another game where we weren't expected to do anything but get our teeth kicked in. And instead we turned it around and ended up being the team that just kind of said, you can deal with that. It was a great moment. And frankly, at that moment, I was ready for us to win the championship. We were going to play Colorado. This team had shown who they were for pretty much since Milton had joined the team. And I had no reason to believe that they weren't going to do that. And it was just phenomenal,
Now, of course, Kevin, that win brings us to the first ever MLS Cup in club history. And if you or anyone else has listened to the history of this podcast or know your FC Dallas history, then you know who the opponent's going to be and you know what's going to happen. It's the damn Colorado Rapids again, and FC Dallas loses to them again in the playoffs.
Yeah, I don't understand that. And frankly, that was the thing that shocked me the most about this result, because over the course of the second half of the season, this team had shown who they were, and they weren't going to be defined by who they had been. They weren't going to let fate get in their way. They weren't going to let, who people thought they were get in the way. They were going to do their thing. It was working. And for a team like Colorado, they should have run them off the pitch.
Yeah, you're talking about a Rapids team that finished 5th in the West, and they only got into the playoffs because of the weird top 8 seeding that MLS tried that year. And they proceeded to basically thug FC Dallas out of the game with 16 fouls committed, just hacking David Ferreira to pieces. David did score first. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, and that's another thing that really surprised me, because the referee that night was Bartolomé Toledo, and he had traditionally been someone who had protected a player like Ferreira.
Yeah.
He had given a yellow card when someone had gotten hit. And actually, it wasn't Ferreira. I mean, yes, Ferreira got fouled, but it was Jackson that got fouled out of the game.
Well, they had to sub him quite early for sure.
Because of fouls. I remember. So I'm there in the end zone watching the game and going, we are not trying to make them work the way we usually do. Granted, the field was a little bit smaller, but again, this is a team that had tried to make you chase the ball, so that when you got into the 80th minute, you were tired mentally and physically. And that's one of the things that helped them make the winning play so often, right?
Yeah.
They weren't doing that. And in fact, as phenomenal as that goal was, and oh my gosh, that was just, it was amazing. That goal was brilliant. And that David got the chance to score it was awesome, because he deserves to score more than he did.
Yeah.
But I literally thought at that point in time, that was the worst thing to happen to this team, because now they have a false sense of confidence. But this game is not going the way they usually do, and this is not the way this team wants to play.
Well, they outshot the Rapids 17-7 and lost. So, it clearly was not a game that was going in their favor. I do wonder in hindsight, Kevin, if this is a thought process I've had looking at the lineup, is if I looked at the lineup correctly, Zach Lloyd did not start at right back.
Correct.
They went with Jackson, but when he could have been in the midfield, they could have started Lloyd. And of course, Heath Pierce didn't play, and there was some controversy with him and Shellis that we'll come back to again in a minute about whether he was healthy or not. So there were definitely some issues going on the Dallas sideline leading into this game, and maybe caused a little bit of a disruption.
Yeah, I mean, it was clearly that it was clear that this team was not who they had been. There was something that I don't know if it was that they, kind of fumbled under pressure, or just, that was just the one off game they had in a string of good games. But yeah, at the wrong place at the wrong time, they weren't who they had been for 3 months. And it ended up being an overtime loss that just,
Here's the question that I always come back to when I look back at this era. Why do FC Dallas fans not hate Colorado more than they do?
Because they kicked the crap out of them in the regular season.
That's what I think it is too. Most of the time they stomp them. It's just the playoffs.
And frankly, unfortunately, FC Dallas fans and Dallas Burn fans have gotten so used to failing in the postseason that they just don't. But I mean, I can tell you, me personally, here's one thing. The thing about the Brimstone Cup happened because both teams hated each other, both fan groups hated each other, and the fan supporters groups got it. They
Without
saw
question.
what's going on, and they're like, hey, let's do something that kind of coalesces this. Colorado never had that opposing supporters group that really coalesced into something that could be an opposing force.
Yeah.
I mean, now they've developed some things and blah, blah, blah. And I'm happy for them because every team should have a supporters group, et cetera. And my God, there were definitely people in Colorado who were trying. Make no mistake. I have good friends up there. I know they were trying as hard as they could, but it never really turned into something that was, the kind of bile that you had between Chicago and Dallas, or Dallas and Houston, or even Dallas and Kansas City, frankly, or Dallas and LA. I mean, there's a number of teams that we don't have any problem hating who haven't kicked us out of the playoffs nearly as much.
Yeah.
And the thing that always surprised me, back when I was just doing the supporters thing before I worked for the team, one of the things I loved doing was road trips. And we never, ever could get Colorado fans to come to Dallas, and they would complain about how hot it is. And I'm like, I don't care how hot it is. Do you want to support your team or not? And it's that kind of, you go, you tailgate with the opposing fans, you both have a laugh, you both have a beer, you cheer against each other during the game, and then at the end you celebrate what you did. It's like, hey, we're able to enjoy soccer. Now, granted, some of that is, the generation of people that lived before MLS came around. But still, I mean, that's a part of supporters culture. And frankly, I think that's part of it, is there never was someone on the fan side that was a big enough personality for us to kind of hate as much as we hated the players. But yeah, no, Colorado's always had a special place in my heart. And if I could design an FC Dallas season, we beat them in either the Open Cup or the last game of the season to win the Shield, or in MLS Cup. Somewhere in there, they get their, that whole, Godfather thing, settle all the family business.
Right.
They are on that list.
Yeah.
Absolutely, they're on that list. And
Rapids hatred aside, we do have to feel good for local boy Drew Moore, who won his first MLS Cup and went on to win more MLS Cups later on. All right.
Absolutely. Great guy.
This cup of two Western teams, a matter of fact, two a little further down, the conference Western teams, basically caused MLS to change their playoff structure so that you wouldn't have that happen again, which brings us onto the future into 2011. Now,
before we get to 2011,
okay, go ahead.
The craziness that was the night after MLS Cup.
Go ahead.
Remember, we just gotten kicked in the shorts because we lost to Colorado when we shouldn't have. And then before any of the fans got home, we found out we lost Dax McCarty for nothing.
Was that before you even got home?
Yeah.
Well, you're getting ahead of yourself.
Before most of the fans got home.
We're going to cover that here in the next little stretch. That's
sure, but that's a part of 2010.
Technically, I suppose it is kind of.
I mean, yeah, it's the transition of 2011.
Yeah.
I get it. But that very much was a part of the MLS Cup experience for me, and I think for a lot of fans, because it literally was, what are you doing? This guy just had a phenomenal season. We just had our best season ever. He was frankly the reason why you could give David the keys to the car, because he would clean up the messes and make an attractive play every once in a while if David was recovered.
I hadn't thought of it in terms of you guys still coming back from the cup when it happened. That's that's an interesting way to think of it.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was a part of the trip, because by the time we got home, he was gone.
Well, that was the first thing we were going to talk about in 2011. Just a second, let me set it up a little bit. Mm-hmm. In 2011, things start to turn sour on Schellas Hyndman. We mentioned a little bit of a disconnect with Heath Pierce, which we're going to come back to in a second. But the draft is basically a bust. They draft Bobby Warshaw, who doesn't really contribute very much.
Nice guy,
but doesn't contribute. And as to why that is, he has a book about it, and you can read about it if you care. Several other players leave, like Dario Sala leaves and Jeff Cunningham leaves. But this is the first most important bullet, Kevin, and you already brought it up, is that insanely, they leave Dax McCarty exposed in the expansion draft in order to protect Erick Alexander. And I went back and looked at the articles on our website at the time, and they talked about the fact that they had multiple teams that were interested in taking Erick Alexander, and they thought, I think, that Dax's contract, which was considerably larger than Erick Alexander's, would protect him. Plus, Dak earlier in his career had gotten into it with Schellas a little bit, although I think by this time he was recovered and they had a good relationship. And some of the heat here falls on Barry Gorman a little bit, but bizarrely, after Dax gets picked, and you and I and everyone else that saw the exposure list were like, crap, Dax is gone. He was picked number one in the whole thing. And then they pull back Daniel Hernandez, who they had left exposed because he was 1,000 years old, and Atiba Harris gets picked. So they lose, like, 2 of the first 4 picks are the Dallas players, which underlines how poorly they protected their roster. Now, granted, when you go to MLS Cup, you got a pretty good roster, but as you say, exposing Dax McCarty in hindsight for a guy that went on to play, another 12 seasons and is still playing in Major League Soccer.
Yeah. Won at least one Shield with New York. Yeah. I mean, he was just getting to where he was I don't know necessarily all-star MLS player, but damn sure right in that next tier in terms of he had proven he could be a quality high-end MLS player. And don't get me wrong, his salary was going to be bigger, the escalators, all that other stuff. I understood the math of it, but that's where other GMs find a way to trade him.
Yeah.
Look, how do we find a way to get value for this player?
Right.
And instead you give him away for free, and you can't even say, well, at least we got whatever for it, right? A bag of baseballs and a bag of cash or something. We didn't even get that.
Yeah. I put some of that on Barry Gorman, who was the technical director at the time. But let me tell you a funny side story of unintended consequences here with this exposing Dax McCarty in favor of Erick Alexander. By the time they get to August of 2011, Erick Alexander gets traded late this season for Jeremy Hall, who FC Dallas had coveted for quite some time. They tried to get him before. Now Hall comes in, he's basically a bust. And by November, now this is like 2 months later, by November 2011, they trade Hall to Toronto for a second-round pick in 2013. Now that pick they used on, wait for it, Ryan Hollingshead.
Oh my gosh.
So, because Ryan Hollingshead slipped to the second round because he was going to take that sabbatical
year off.
Right.
Yeah.
So Dax McCarty's exposure leads to Ryan Hollingshead playing for FC Dallas. So just a side note on a chain of events and unintended consequences. And how sometimes you get where you are, not because you plan to.
Right. No. And I mean, remind me when he comes on board.
Well, he doesn't come in until 2014, so the payoff, of course, is way down the road. And obviously, 5 mistakes happen that led them to getting Ryan Hollingshead. So it's it's just funny how sometimes things work out. But let's go back to 2011, which is where we were in our history. And as crazy as leaving Dax unprotected is, they protect Heath Pierce and then pretty much instantly trade him to Chivas USA for allocation money, basically because between MLS Cup and the start of 2011, he's mouthing off on Twitter about Schellas and about he's hurt or not hurt. And you may have forgotten this. I had forgotten until I looked up the articles. The club made him close down his Twitter account. I don't remember that.
I did not remember that.
Yeah. And so obviously, I think by the time they do the expansion draft, they probably know that they're going to move him on. And so they protect him because he has so much value. So that expansion draft was complicated, and Heath Pearce, as short of the time as he was here, no doubt though, Kevin, excellent player. And I wish they had kept him.
Yes. But I mean, it was obvious that and I remember thinking this at the time, whether he was really injured or what the dynamic was with Schellas or whatever. I remember thinking that it was a relationship that wasn't going anywhere constructively. So that was the right play. Frankly, my sense at the time, and I'm not saying this because I heard anything while I was inside. This is just generally, looking at the situation. Schellas is not someone to put up with someone having an injury that they can play through maybe and not even trying. I'm not saying that's exactly what Heath was doing, but I think that's the way Schellas perceived it. And, at the same time, I mean, by the time you get to the end of the season, you've gotten the crap kicked out of you if you're an MLS player.
Yeah.
And, so, for all I know, Heath was legitimately injured, shouldn't have been playing, would have been risking serious injury. What was that character in, Friday Night Lights, the running back that played and ended up playing, and he had a torn meniscus and it got worse and he never played again or something like that. What if that's what Heath was dealing with, something along those lines. So, again, that's a situation where I think they got sideways because Schellas viewed the way you deal with injuries differently than Heath did. And I mean, Heath was a fringe U.S. national team player, so he had a reason to protect his body, right?
Yeah.
Well,
I don't begrudge Schellas or any coach for that matter getting rid of players that he's not getting along with, it's not working out with. Now it happens to have been Vandenberg and Heath Pearce and perhaps Dax McCarty. Schellas, as many guys as hate playing for Schellas, like Bobby Warshaw, there's guys that love playing for Schellas, like Ugo and Daniel Hernandez. He's obviously a love-hate kind of coach. And, it's his team. And, and we can be, in hindsight, we can be critical. And clearly some mistakes were made. I lay some of them on Barry Gorman as well. Schellas, however, in the end, probably at that point, even though Gorman was TD, Schellas probably had the power. So it's still a lot of it's on Schellas. But there are some good moves in 2011. Ricardo Villar comes in, who was a solid Event Spectacular ad.
Phenomenal.
Yeah, solid player. Mikel Galindo.
Unfortunately, we had to use him way too much. But
yeah, he had to play a lot. Mikel Galindo comes in from Chivas USA. Not terrible pickup. Funnily enough, they have to get Andrew Jacobson from DC United basically to fill the hole of Dax McCarty being unprotected and allowed to go.
Yeah.
But the best move, Kevin, of 2011, and I don't think there's any question this is true, is the signing of Fabian Castillo, who was essentially, we're going to say, found by Oscar Pareja. Now, Fabio's peak comes later, but at 18 years old, this was one of the first huge prospect type signings we've seen in club history.
Absolutely. And I mean, on my list, I had him and Zach Lloyd as emerging this season. And absolutely, I mean, the best pure left winger I think the team's ever had in terms of raw talent and unopposable skill.
Yeah, he had pace that no one could match. Now, 2011, of course, is on the positive side. We'll get to the negative in a second. On the positive side, 2011 is the year of Breck Shea. 11 goals and 4 assists from the left flank, left wing. This is a legitimate MLS MVP caliber season. He doesn't win it, of course, but he's legitimately in the conversation. He's also MLS All-Star at MLS Best 11. This is peak Breck Shea when he was one of the most dangerous wingers, if not the most dangerous winger in the league. And all the noise about moves to Europe started to happen, and he broke into the national team.
Yep, absolutely. And it was wonderful to see just because he was so youthful. He was so happy with the way he played. But in kind of a Ronnie O'Brien kind of way, just kind of that evil feral grin of, I'm going to do something that you're not going to like, and I'm going to have fun doing it, and the fans are going to love it. That was just kind of his style. It was really a joy to see. Yeah, I mean, I had him on the explosion in this season, and he definitely exploded in ways that, my God, if David had only been able to.
Yeah, he played the way he was in life. Free spirit, off the cuff, artistic, great player. And that season was such a joy to watch him. But as you say, Kevin, the negative side of 2011 is, of course, David Ferreira's broken ankle in the sixth game of the season when Vancouver's Jonathan Leathers, screw that guy, tackles David and breaks his ankle.
And I, for the life of me, I still don't understand why that wasn't a red card. And there's a lot of reasons why I should soft sell this as much as possible. But at the end of the day, it's from behind. The cleats are exposed. Before you even make contact, it screams red card. And this is after all the indications that, hey, you've got to protect players, blah, blah, blah. And if I remember correctly, there were 2 or 3 other major injuries, Javier Morales and maybe a couple others, kind of within a 1 or 2 week period. And David was one of them. And I remember being furious.
Injuries happen to every team in the league, right, Kev? But David was their talisman. He was such the pivotal piece beyond anyone else's single season. He was so much the key for this club in this era of time.
Yeah, and I mean, you can go through and find probably a handful of players over every era of Major League Soccer, whether it's Jaime Moreno and Marco Echeverri or Peter Novak or whatever. He was, along with Javier Morales at that point in time, like the creativeness that was in MLS. And the fact that it got taken away was crushing for the league, not just for FC Dallas, but obviously, I mean, frankly, the success that Breck had despite David not being on there was pretty amazing.
Yeah. Imagine if David had been around.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
so,
as we mentioned, Kevin, the season started going south. But on the other hand, and this just shows you how the world works, 2011 is the year of the club's arguable best CONCACAF Champions League run. In round one, they face Alancia, which is an El Salvadorian team, and they win 2-0 in aggregate. And the second round, the next round, is the most important Champions League game in FC Dallas history when they become the first MLS side to win a game in Mexico, beating Pumas down in on their home turf on a Marvin Chavez game winner. This is a landmark win in franchise history.
Absolutely. And it was a huge moment. I loved it. As a matter of fact, random story, but I ended up going on our honeymoon a little bit later after that and was wearing an FC Dallas jersey and ran into someone who was wearing a Pumas jersey.
Oh, that's fun.
I just grabbed the shield and winked at him, and he gave me a dirty look and walked away. It was like, yes, sir, we beat you on your turf. There's no excuses this time.
Yeah, first MLS team to win in Mexico. A red letter day. Circle that one.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I'm hoping at some point there's an MLS team that wins it all.
Yeah.
So say that was the beginning, and now here's the culmination of that. But I mean, that's years ago.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it was a breakthrough moment. I remember a lot of people talking about it. It was very a tense game. It was very much a tense game. Every moment mattered, and frankly, I was really proud of the way the team stayed focused and found a way to get it done.
Unfortunately, FCD didn't get out of their group because they won only one other game, and that was against Toronto. The biggest debacle of that Champions League run was against Taro FC, which is a Panamanian team, which on paper you would think FC Dallas was handled, but they whacked Dallas 5-3, which is that kind of broke the club's spirit, both in terms of the Champions League and even just in terms of the season. That was a tough run after that Taro loss.
Yeah, and I mean that's something I've never really understood. You have a team from the United States, whether it's the national team or a club team, playing, especially one of those teams like Panama, Trinidad and Tobago, Costa Rica, where they've had enough success. They've got some good players, Blas Perez, et cetera. Whether you're dealing with a club team or a national team, if you're playing Panama, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Costa Rica, they've had enough success. They've got enough talent that if you give them an opportunity, they're motivated enough to beat you. And I remember the team organizing a trip for fans to go down, and I definitely got the sense that there was a lot of, oh, we got this in the bag. I'm like, no, we don't. You have to bring a killer instinct every game. And yeah, sometimes you're going to play Allianz, or however you pronounce it. I apologize that I've just butchered that. But there are going to be other times where you're going to play Taro and you're going to get your teeth kicked in if you don't bring your A game. And we didn't. And it cost us.
Yeah, in the Champions League, any team you're playing, except maybe a Mexican team, it's their biggest game of the year, and the Mexican teams are really good. So it's always going to be difficult. Home, road, it doesn't matter. They're going to bring their A game. Now, when you combine the Champions League, the weight of just playing in it and the losses to Taro and the loss of David Ferreira, the back end of the season starts to go south, and they finish on a 3-7-1 run, which is not very good. And they fall to fourth place in the West, which ought to tell you that how good a start they actually had, that they still managed to finish fourth in the West. And, Kevin, they had an astounding 52 points, which is remarkable for 52 points to be fourth place, because I went back and looked at the standings, and the top four teams in the West had more points than everybody in the East. It was a completely unbalanced Western Conference that year. It was just a staggeringly good conference.
Yeah, it was. And I remember thinking I was really kind of torn at the time, because the team still had talent, right? But they felt like they were burned out, whether it was the travel or the injuries, or whether opposing teams had figured out how to kind of play Ricardo. The reality was, by the time they got to the playoffs, they just didn't have a lot left in the tank. And they couldn't get up to, if I remember correctly, was it the Red Bulls?
New York Red Bulls. It was a single game elimination in Frisco, but they did crash out to an 0-2 scoreline. And as you say, we kicked off 2011 talking about this is when it starts to go downhill for Shellis. And you rightly say that over the course of this season, it started to go down and go south. And honestly, this is a big what if year, because we've talked about it the whole season. If you don't lose David Ferreira, what does that team do? I mean, 52 points when you finish on 3-7-1. I mean, that's do a win in Mexico in the Champions League without David Ferreira. I mean, there's some big what ifs on this team. But when you lose a guy like David Ferreira, you just know this season's in the end going to go downhill.
Yeah, I mean, if it had been a good replacement for Dax, which Andrew Jacobson was not a bad player.
Solid.
You know, I mean, he wasn't a phenomenal player, but he also wasn't trash, right?
Right.
One who contributed. He scored a few goals here and there. But he really did the dirty work of cleaning things up around. And unfortunately, when it was Ricardo, there's just wasn't enough creativity, and he had to do too much work. But, so that could have been a good move. But, yeah, with David, that easily could have been a return to MLS Cup. It just wasn't. And they couldn't even pour a team from a really poor East. And it was frustrating. Very frustrating.
It was a frustrating finish. All right, everybody, that's the end of part one. As usual, if you enjoyed this, please consider contributing to our cause at patreon.com/thirddegree. I hope you enjoyed the first 2 years of the 2010 to 2014 run. We'll be back next week with part two, which is 2012 through 2014. And we'll finish off this podcast with some more fantastic history jaunts with our good friend Kevin Lindstrom. We hope you'll tune in then. See you next week.